One part of our mission in Philosophy 225 is to explore compatibilism between reason and faith. And we're going to bring compatibilism to examine human life and good life. Let's first review our key terminology. We'll look at peace on earth as an exemplar of compatibilism and note evidence of antagonism referred to in peace on earth. And then we'll look at some examples of compatibilism within the text. First, review of key terminology. Compatibilism. It is a view. It is the view that reason and faith pursue distinct areas of truth, but that one may support the other. St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, argues that reasoning may support faith. Faith. It is an infused habit, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, which means it is a habit that is put in me by divine love. Moreover, faith is an intellectual habit, according to St. Thomas Aquinas. It is a habit of the mind. In short, a person with faith believes well. And finally, faith is a theological virtue. According to St. Thomas Aquinas, theological virtues empower my relationships with God. Here's a definition of faith. Faith is the theological virtue empowering me to believe in truths bestowed by divine revelation. St. Thomas Aquinas refers to truths of faith as articles of faith. So I'll continue to use that terminology. And another useful term is external inducement. So you may hear me referring to external inducement. Peace on Earth, as an encyclical letter, pursues compatibilism through and through. Encyclical letters provide explanations, interpretations, directions on matters of faith. Throughout Peace on Earth, there are arguments, concepts are taught. Many of these come from philosophy, from deontology, and from political philosophy, going all the way back to the ancient world. In conjunction with reasoning, Peace on Earth also refers to articles of faith, and, for example, quotations from sacred scripture. There's also evidence of antagonism in Peace on Earth. In short, there's a conflict today, pretend we're in the 1960s, there's a conflict today between science and technology on the one hand and what we believe by faith. And our author refers to, on page 1, science and technology. These are areas of reason. Let's read Pope St. John out loud. That a marvelous order predominates in the world of living beings and in the forces of nature is the plain lesson which the progress of modern research and the discoveries of technology teach us. So in short, science and technology are discovering truths about the natural world, and at the same time, the truths of science and technology are informing how we govern, and they're informing things like the military and the weapons that the military creates. On page 3, our author makes the following important statement. Many people think that the laws which govern man's relations with the state are the same as those which regulate the blind elemental forces of the universe. Science and technology pursue the blind elemental forces of the universe. So, for example, physics has, in the 20th century, studies the atom. And by studying the atom, physics contributed weapons to arm nations, which as a result intimidate and cause anxiety to human populations. And this development is in conflict with what we believe by faith, says Pope St. John. By faith, we believe that all humans have an inherent value and can't be or shouldn't be coerced and intimidated. This antagonism between reason and faith is important because all of our authors from the 1960s, and that's all of our authors to the end of the semester, each of them observes that science and technology in some way are in conflict with important values. Why is this happening? That's something we ought to think about. Okay, let's look at some examples of compatibilism on the part of our author. First, on page 4. On page 4, Pope St. John teaches a fundamental principle that may guide our own conduct as persons and also the government. Pope St. John writing, "Each individual man is truly a person, and moreover, what that means is each of us has an intellect and a will, and together these powers cooperate in our conduct as a person. And moreover, according to Pope St. John, having both an intellect and a will grants each of us a natural dignity. Each of us ought to be respected as a result of having these two powers." So these are truths that are taught by Aristotle. These are truths that are part of our ethics and also our view of what a person is. Pope St. John then goes on to write, "When, furthermore, we consider man's personal dignity from the standpoint of divine revelation, inevitably our estimate of it is incomparably increased." So a truth that we learn by reasoning, that each of us is a person, is also given in sacred scripture or by divine revelation. And in a way, what we learn by reason and what we learn by faith agree. And Pope St. John emphasizes that it's increased when we add what we learn by divine revelation. So that's an example of compatibilism between reason and faith. Another example on page 12 shows faith supporting reason. Pope St. John writing, "Hence, to claim one's rights and ignore one's duties or only half fulfill them is like building a house with one hand and tearing it down with another, or with the other." That's a paraphrase from sacred scripture, and Pope St. John uses this paraphrase from sacred scripture to help explain an idea taught by philosophy, by deontology. That's similar to Louis Simi Alcott and Henry Thoreau's use of sacred scripture in the 19th century. They often paraphrase from sacred scripture to explain their reasoning or to explain an argument. So there, something of faith supports reasoning. And finally, on page 19, an example of compatibilism similar to St. Thomas Aquinas' idea. Our author, Pope St. John, is talking about government authority, and he quotes St. Paul. St. Paul teaches, "There is no power but from God." As persons of faith, we may simply believe this statement as true, and we don't require any analysis or explanation. In Peace on Earth, our author next quotes a church authority who studied St. Paul and given considerable scholarly thought to what our author, or what St. Paul means. And so this source then explains what St. Paul means, or provides what could be an external inducement to faithfully believing what St. Paul teaches us. So reasoning here supports faith. In part 5, our author, having spoken to the whole world, now speaks to the Catholic world or the Catholic faithful. Part 5 is titled Pastoral Exhortations, and it's beyond our readings for this week. However, there are some useful ideas to add to our idea of Pope St. John's compatibilism, so I will summarize what he says. Having pointed out the importance of the common good and the government for all human persons, Pope St. John asserts in part 5 that persons of faith ought to pursue public service, that persons of faith ought to pursue expertise, for example, the natural sciences and public policy and medicine. That's his first and most important proposal. Our author also seems to provide some explanation of the antagonism he's mentioned between science and technology on the one hand and what we believe by faith, that all persons have a natural dignity. On page 63, Pope St. John refers to a divorce between faith and practice. By practice, he means like the conduct of the professions, scientists, physicians, nurses, engineers, how they function day to day, their values, methods, that's their practice. Well, Pope St. John is stating here that faith is excluded from the practices of the professions, in some cases deliberately. Perhaps persons of faith at times have to hide their religion in order to be nurses or physicians or engineers or chemists. Also, Pope St. John on page 63 states that education in the sciences and the humanities is far advanced in comparison to our religious education. So part of the antagonism that we're seeing in our culture in the 1960s is because our religious education needs to improve, to complement, to contribute along with the truths of science and the humanities. And then finally, in part 5, our author makes the following statement, and I'll just read half of the sentence. This is on page 62. To effect a thorough integration of the principal spiritual values with those of science, technology, and the professions. This is a good sort of summary statement of what our author is proposing on part 5. It's in a way stronger than just compatibilism. Integration means, all areas of spiritual values collaborating with, working together with the values of areas of expertise. Spiritual values for Pope St. John, I think, must include articles of faith, but also our human relationships and the reciprocity that forms between people, and our culture. For Pope St. John, those are all spiritual values. They're non-material values. These ought to be integrated with the values of areas of expertise. So a strong statement of compatibilism in part 5.